Remember those money-saving cooking tricks so clever they only lived in old cookbooks? They turned scraps into supper and made tight budgets feel a little less heavy. When did we forget the secrets that once helped us survive? Potato peel broth was one of those quiet genius ideas that made the most out of the bare minimum. You had potato skins piling up on the counter, and instead of tossing them out, cooks would throw them into a pot of water, maybe with an onion skin or two, and simmer it down into a golden, earthy broth. It may not sound like much today, but back then it was practically liquid gold. Rich in nutrients and surprisingly flavorful, it served as the base for soups, stews, or even gravy. Old cookbooks were filled with reminders to never waste a peel, and this was the perfect example of why. In times when every cent and calorie counted, this broth delivered on both. You could salt it lightly, strain it, and store it for later, and no one would bat an eye if it was used more than once for multiple meals. The broth could also be thickened with flour or mashed potatoes to create something heartier, especially when meat wasn't on the menu. When families had more mouths than money, this was one of the smartest ways to stretch a sack of potatoes into several meals. A humble peel became a warm, nourishing bowl of comfort. Breadcrumb stretchers were one of the oldest tricks in the frugal cook's playbook, and there's a reason they stuck around. The idea was simple but clever. When you didn't have enough meat to go around, bulk it up with breadcrumbs, or crushed cereal, oats, or even cracker dust. Suddenly, a single pound of beef became enough for 6 patties or a whole loaf. Old cookbooks from the 1930s through the 1970s had full sections devoted to stretchers, with ratios and substitutions depending on what you had on hand. The beauty of breadcrumbs was that they were essentially free, made from stale bread or saved scraps no one would eat anyway. When seasoned well and mixed with an egg or two, they helped hold everything together, add texture, and absorb flavor like a sponge. Meatballs, meatloaf, hamburger patties, even stuffed peppers relied on this trick to get by. This wasn't just about saving money, it was about survival with dignity. Families were able to enjoy their favorite meals without feeling the sting of scarcity quite so sharply. In a way, breadcrumb stretchers were the unsung heroes of wartime and Depression-era cooking, quietly making dinner possible, one crumb at a time. Mock apple pie with Ritz crackers is the kind of recipe that sounds like a joke until you try it. This Depression-era dessert was born when apples were either too expensive or too hard to come by, but families still wanted something sweet to finish off the day. Enter the Ritz cracker, a salty, buttery, flaky little miracle that, when soaked in sugar syrup and lemon juice, somehow started to taste like baked apples. Cookbooks from the 1930s described the recipe as appleless apple pie, and you could find it in community recipe cards all the way through the 1970s. The crackers were layered inside a crust and spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg. The filling baked down into a warm, sticky, and surprisingly convincing substitute for the real thing. If someone didn't tell you, you probably would never know. What made this dish so genius was how it turned an ordinary pantry staple into a dessert that felt luxurious in a time when luxuries were few and far between. People would gather around the table, pass around the pie, and pretend it was made with fresh-picked fruit from a local orchard, and honestly, most didn't mind the difference one bit. Meatless gravy with drippings was one of those flavor-saving secrets every thrifty cook swore by. When meat was scarce, but flavor was still essential, the pan drippings left behind after cooking even a small piece of meat became pure treasure. A few tablespoons of fat, a sprinkle of flour, and a bit of water or broth was all it took to whip up a rich, velvety sauce. This gravy didn't need chunks of meat. It carried the essence of it, thanks to the browned bits and rendered fat that clung to the bottom of every skillet. In many households, meatless gravy showed up more often than actual meat, poured over potatoes, toast, rice, or biscuits to give a little something extra to otherwise plain staples. Some added herbs or a splash of vinegar for zing. Others stirred in canned mushrooms or onions to mimic texture and body. It was a dish built entirely out of scraps and instinct, and it brought comfort when comfort was in short supply. If someone managed to get a hold of real broth, they'd stretch it with drippings to double the yield. It wasn't fancy, but it was satisfying. and that made all the difference. Reused pickle juice marinade might sound odd today, but back then it was a beloved trick that saved both money and flavor. When a jar of pickles was finished, the brine left behind was never poured down the drain. Instead, frugal home cooks would use it to marinate meats, soak onions, dress potato salads, or even brighten up beans. The vinegar and spices acted like an instant flavor booster, turning bland ingredients into something tangy, zippy, and unexpectedly delicious. Pickle brine also tenderized cheaper cuts of meat, making it a go-to solution for tougher steaks or leftover roast. In fact, the practice was so widespread that old cookbooks listed pickle juice right alongside salt and pepper in many recipes. Some even recommended saving different types of brine, dill, sweet, or hot, and matching them to particular dishes. It was all part of the waste-nothing attitude of the time. Even if your pantry was nearly empty, you could make dinner feel interesting again with nothing more than a splash of what was left in the pickle jar. It's proof that creativity doesn't need fancy ingredients, just a good memory, a bit of vinegar, and a whole lot of heart. Bacon grease jar cooking was more than a habit. It was a household tradition passed down through generations. After cooking bacon, no one ever threw out the grease. It was poured into a tin can, jar, or ceramic container and kept right on the stove or in the fridge, ready to use in just about everything. This rendered fat added smoky, savory depth to greens, eggs, cornbread, gravies, and even biscuits. For families on a budget, it was a goldmine of flavor that cost nothing extra. Some cooks would use it to start soups and stews, others to fry potatoes or season beans. A little bacon fat could turn the most humble vegetable into a side dish worth remembering. Cookbooks from the 1940s and 50s often listed bacon drippings as a key ingredient, not just a substitution. And when butter or lard was hard to find during wartime rationing, bacon grease picked up the slack with ease. It was efficient, it was tasty, and it felt like a little act of defiance, taking a scrap and making something wonderful with it. Even today, some home kitchens still keep a jar on the back burner because good flavor never goes out of style. Oatmeal meatloaf binder might not sound glamorous, but it was one of the most dependable cooking tricks of the era. When breadcrumbs were in short supply, or when a cook just needed something heartier, rolled oats stepped up to the plate. Mixed into ground beef or pork with eggs and spices, oats gave structure to meatloaf, absorbed flavor, and made every bite stretch just a little farther. They were cheap, shelf-stable, and widely available, even during hard times. And unlike bread, they didn't dry out the mixture. Instead, they kept everything moist while adding fiber and body. Depression-era and wartime cookbooks praised oatmeal not only for its price but for its versatility, showing up in main courses as often as in breakfast. Some recipes even suggested soaking the oats in milk before mixing them in for an extra soft texture. For big families trying to feed everyone on a budget, swapping breadcrumbs for oats became second nature. No one cared that it wasn't gourmet. They were just glad to have a warm, filling slice of something savory. And with ketchup on top and mashed potatoes on the side, meatloaf night became a cozy, familiar ritual in homes across the country. Stale bread pudding was the kind of dessert that felt like a miracle. You started with scraps, slices of old, hard bread that no one wanted to eat, and somehow turned them into something soft, sweet, and deeply satisfying. The recipe was simple. Soak the bread in milk, add a little sugar and cinnamon, crack in an egg or two, and bake until golden and custardy. The result was a warm, gooey pudding that felt far richer than the ingredients would suggest. For families with tight grocery budgets, this was a way to avoid waste and still have something sweet at the end of the day. In some variations, raisins or chopped apples were added when available. Others poured syrup or canned fruit over the top for a little flair. No matter how it was made, it was always a dish rooted in resourcefulness. Cookbooks from the 1940s practically sang its praises, and community recipe swaps often featured a dozen different versions. It wasn't just a dessert, it was a lesson in creativity, frugality, and the magic of making do. And if you ask anyone who grew up eating it, they'll probably say it still tastes like love. Cabbage stretch soup was more than just a recipe. It was a lifeline in a pot. In times when meat was rare and vegetables limited, cabbage became the star of the soup pot. Shredded thin and simmered with water, onion, and maybe a little broth if you were lucky. It created a warm, hearty base that could feed a family for pennies. Sometimes potatoes, carrots, or bits of pasta were added to bulk it up, but cabbage was always the anchor. It had the advantage of being cheap, easy to grow, and surprisingly filling. The best part? You didn't need much else. The longer it cooked, the sweeter and more tender it became, soaking up any seasoning you threw its way. Old cookbooks and wartime manuals often included cabbage soup under sustaining meals, or meatless mains, emphasizing its value for both health and economy. Some versions were inspired by European immigrants who had long relied on cabbage in their home cooking. It's not fancy, it doesn't pretend to be, but cabbage soup meant something back then. It meant warmth on cold nights, a meal that could stretch to feed everyone, and the quiet triumph of making something out of almost nothing. Eggless mayonnaise substitute was a lifesaver when rationing hit hard and eggs disappeared from pantry shelves. Homemakers got creative, crafting sandwich spreads and dressings without a single yolk. The secret was evaporated milk, mixed with vinegar or lemon juice, mustard, and a touch of oil. The acid thickened the milk into something creamy and tangy, surprisingly close to the real deal. This makeshift mayo showed up in potato salads, slaws, sandwiches, and deviled egg imposters alike. Wartime cookbooks often included multiple versions, each with different ratios or seasonings, depending on what was available. Some added sugar or paprika, while others leaned savory with onion powder and garlic. It wasn't about perfect replication. It was about good enough flavor when options were scarce. This DIY condiment not only stretched your supplies, but also kept familiar dishes on the table, boosting morale when meals were otherwise bare bones. And for families trying to create something resembling a normal lunch, that made all the difference. It's one of those small, clever tricks that helped people hold on to their routines and their dignity when the world around them was anything but predictable. One crust vegetable pie was a budget-saving marvel hiding in plain sight. In the pages of countless Depression-era and wartime cookbooks, you'd find this clever suggestion: skip the top crust. Why? Because flour, lard, and butter were rationed, and a double crust was considered an unnecessary luxury. Instead, home cooks would pour a simple vegetable filling, often made from onions, carrots, potatoes, or cabbage, into a single pie shell and bake it until golden. These pies weren't flashy, but they were hearty, reliable, and warm. The single crust cut costs in half while still delivering the texture and comfort people craved. Occasionally, if a family had a little meat on hand, they'd chop it finely and mix it into the filling to boost the flavor and stretch it further. Cheese, if available, might go on top. But most often, it was just vegetables, a thickened sauce, and that humble base of baked dough. It was more than enough. The one crust pie reflected the kind of frugality that didn't feel like deprivation. It felt like smart, resourceful living. For people managing rations and rising prices, it offered something surprisingly rich, the feeling that dinner was still something to look forward to. Creamed, canned corn with a flour slurry was one of those dishes that made something ordinary feel just a little indulgent. The idea was to take a can of corn, cheap, shelf-stable, and always on hand, and give it a makeover. You'd pour the corn, liquid and all, into a saucepan and stir in a quick mix of water and flour. As it simmered, the slurry thickened the liquid into a creamy, starchy sauce that hugged every kernel. Some recipes suggested a splash of milk or a dab of margarine if you had it. But even without those, the final result was comforting. It mimicked the texture of creamed corn without needing fresh cream or butter, two things that were either rationed or too expensive for many homes. This little side dish showed up at dinner tables next to meatloaf, fried potatoes, or bean patties, giving the meal a creamy contrast and helping to fill plates without much cost. It's a great example of how far a single can and a spoonful of flour could go. Cookbooks promoted this trick for its thrift, but people remembered it because it worked. Simple, smart, and warm. What more could you ask for? Potato pancakes from leftover mash were the kind of meal that reminded everyone how nothing in the kitchen had to go to waste. Once the dinner plates were cleared and the mashed potatoes cooled in the fridge overnight, those cold spuds were ready for their next act. Mixed with a little flour, maybe an egg if you could spare one, and diced onion or chives, the leftovers were shaped into patties and fried until golden and crispy on the outside, warm and soft in the middle. These potato cakes were quick, satisfying, and endlessly adaptable. You could make them with herbs, leftover meat bits, or even a little shredded cheese if it was payday. They showed up as breakfast, lunch, or a side dish at dinner. Frying them in bacon grease gave them a smoky kick, while using margarine made them lighter but still delicious. Either way, these crispy rounds gave families something filling and familiar without spending another cent. It wasn't about reinventing the wheel, it was about looking at what you had and asking, what else can this become? In tough times, these potato pancakes answered that question better than most meals ever could. The rice and raisin breakfast bowl was one of those deeply humble meals that somehow managed to feel special. It was born from leftovers and pantry scraps, nothing more than cooked white rice, a handful of raisins, and a spoonful of sugar or syrup. Sometimes a little milk was poured on top, sometimes not. Yet it was a dish that stuck around for decades in American kitchens, especially during World War II and the Depression, when boxed cereals were a luxury and eggs were being rationed. This was the kind of breakfast that let families wake up to something warm and filling without spending anything new. It was also incredibly versatile. Cinnamon, nutmeg, or a drop of vanilla could turn it into something closer to a dessert. Some versions even added chopped apples or stewed prunes when fruit was available. But at its core, it was all about stretching rice into one more meal, one more bowl, one more morning where a full stomach meant a stronger day ahead. For kids especially, this sweet and simple bowl was often remembered not for what it lacked, but for how good it felt to start the day with it. The vegetable scrap stock pot was less a recipe and more a mindset. In homes where waste wasn't an option, every peel, stem, and stub found a second life. Onion skins, carrot tops, celery leaves, and even wilted herbs all went into a pot of water, simmering quietly on the stove. The result was a rich, flavorful broth that cost nothing but time. This stock formed the base of soups, stews, gravies, and casseroles during the 1930s and 40s, especially when meat broth was too costly. Some families even kept a container in the fridge labeled stock scraps, filling it until it was time to boil a batch. It was communal cooking at its core, neighbors sharing tricks, reminding one another that everything still had value. Today we'd call it sustainable. Back then, it was just good sense. And when you think of a soup that starts with scraps and ends in comfort, you see why this method lasted. Homemade cracker crumbs were a quiet staple in every frugal kitchen. When flour was rationed or store-bought breadcrumbs ran out, cooks turned to saltines. Crushed with a rolling pin or jar, saltine crumbs became a cheap, dependable substitute for flour in coating, binding, and topping dishes. They were used to bread fish, stretch meatloaf, thicken casseroles, or crisp up baked vegetables. Cookbooks from the 1940s and 50s recommended cracker crumbs in almost every savory recipe, and even some sweet ones. Their long shelf life and crisp texture made them a pantry hero. A box of saltines could last weeks, and the final stale bits were never wasted, just crushed into crumbs and reused. Some families seasoned the crumbs with herbs or onion powder to add flavor when cheese or spices were out of reach. It was a quiet trick that helped meals taste better when money was tight. A handful of saltine crumbs, used wisely, went farther than anyone expected. Rebaked biscuit pudding was an old-time dessert built on thrift and creativity. When biscuits dried out, they weren't tossed. They were transformed. Cooks crumbled them, soaked them in sweetened milk, and rebaked them with butter, cinnamon, or nutmeg. The result was a soft, rich pudding, similar to bread pudding but heartier. Raisins or apple bits were common add-ins, and syrup or jam on top added extra sweetness when available. The pudding came out dense, sweet, and comforting, ideal for stretching rations without feeling deprived. Cookbooks and newsletters often listed it under frugal sweets or second-day desserts, emphasizing its resourceful roots. It showed families that you didn't need fresh ingredients to make something warm and satisfying. Even if it's rarely made today, back then it symbolized the belief that nothing edible should go to waste. It wasn't just dessert. It was proof of perseverance, creativity, and care. Carrot mold salad was the kind of dish that defined its era. Made from lemon gelatin, shredded carrots, vinegar, and sometimes pineapple or celery, it created a jiggly, sweet-savory mold served cold. Wartime cookbooks often called it a refrigerator salad, easy to prepare ahead and stretch across several meals. Carrots were cheap, easy to grow, and full of vitamins, making them a favorite for Victory Garden cooks. Gelatin gave the dish its firm structure and allowed for clean slices. It became a familiar sight at picnics, church suppers, and potlucks, where something bright and affordable was always welcome. Some recipes added chopped peppers for crunch, but the core idea was simple: make vegetables feel festive. It may look odd today, but it represented optimism and invention during hard times. A shimmering slice of carrot mold might not be flashy, but it held pride and purpose in every bite. Stuffed cabbage with grain fillers was a shining example of kitchen ingenuity in hard times. Cabbage leaves were blanched until pliable, then wrapped around a filling of ground meat stretched with rice, oats, or even mashed potatoes. The grains weren't just filler. They turned a half-pound of meat into a full family meal. These rolls were baked in tomato sauce or simmered on the stove, letting the flavors meld. The dish was cheap, satisfying, and easy to make in large batches. It also drew from Eastern European traditions brought over by immigrants who knew how to stretch ingredients wisely. During wartime, meals like this weren't just clever, they were necessary. Government booklets encouraged home cooks to stretch meat wherever possible, and this dish did just that: efficient, nourishing, and delicious. Some families skipped meat altogether, using seasoned rice and onions. But no matter how you made it, stuffed cabbage always meant the same thing. Someone took time to roll and wrap dinner by hand. Homemade noodle scraps were a staple in any kitchen with a flour sack and rolling pin nearby. When families made pie crust or biscuits, leftover dough wasn't wasted. It was rolled thin, cut into strips, and left to dry on floured cloth before being dropped into broth. These noodles weren't fancy, but they were sturdy, the kind that bulked up a pot of soup when ingredients were scarce. Some added a pinch of salt or parsley, but most kept it plain. Community cookbooks offered tips for drying and storing these scraps, warning not to stack them wet. During the war, when packaged pasta was expensive or hard to find, this trick kept soups hearty and bellies full. You didn't need a pasta machine, just a knife and some practice. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. When every scrap of dough counted, these noodles helped stretch meals and keep families fed. Savory bread custard casserole was a smart way to turn scraps into a full meal. Leftover bread, no matter how stale, was cubed and placed into a baking dish. Then came a simple mix of milk, eggs, and whatever veggies or meat were available: onions, spinach, sausage, whatever was left over. The bread soaked it all in and baked into a golden, bubbling dish that smelled like home. Some added cheese on top, others used buttered crumbs or drippings for crunch. No two versions were alike, and that was the beauty of it. Wartime cookbooks and church recipe leaflets often featured it under names like strata or custard bake. They all relied on the same idea: make something delicious with what's already on hand. Whether served for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, it was warm, flexible, and filling. Turnip top greens proved that frugal food could still taste great. The leafy tops of turnips, often discarded today, were once a staple in thrifty kitchens. Washed and sautéed in bacon grease or butter, they became a peppery, nutrient-rich side dish. Cookbooks called them garden skillet greens and praised them for iron and vitamins, especially important when meat was scarce. A splash of vinegar or some chopped onions helped round out the flavor. During the Depression and wartime, these showed up often on dinner plates. They weren't glamorous, but they were nutritious and practically free. Paired with cornbread or beans, they stretched far and filled the plate. For many families, this was less about flavor and more about gratitude, about using what the garden gave without wasting a thing. Sour milk baking substitutes were a reliable trick from the old kitchen playbook. When milk spoiled, and it often did without refrigeration, homemakers didn't panic. They baked with it. The acidity of sour milk, paired with a bit of baking soda, gave baked goods a fluffy rise and a rich flavor that mimicked buttermilk. Cookbooks from the 1930s and 40s treated sour milk like an essential, with entire sections dedicated to how to use it in cakes, biscuits, or pancakes. Some cooks even soured fresh milk intentionally with lemon juice or vinegar just to keep recipes consistent. And it wasn't just about avoiding waste. It was also about making delicious, fluffy food out of things that would have otherwise been tossed. Housewives during wartime learned to see every ingredient as usable, and sour milk was no different. Even today, some bakers still insist that sour milk makes better cornbread than anything else. It was one of those tricks that stuck because it worked, and because it proved that even spoiled food could still feed a family. Cold potato sandwiches were a humble invention from kitchens that had more leftovers than groceries. Leftover mashed potatoes, often cold and stiff from the night before, were mashed again and mixed with a bit of onion, mustard, or even chopped pickles. That mixture got spread between slices of bread, usually homemade or store-bought white, and served as a no-fuss lunch or light supper. It wasn't fancy, but it filled you up, and that mattered more than anything during lean years. Some families even added shredded carrots or herbs if they had them, giving the sandwich a bit more color and crunch. For factory workers or school children, it packed easily and kept well. You wouldn't find it in a deli, but you would find it scribbled in the margins of old cookbooks and passed down by word of mouth. It was part of the broader philosophy of waste nothing, turning yesterday's dinner into today's meal without anyone going hungry. Strange to some now, but to many it just tasted like home. Vegetable pie with mashed potato crust was a comforting dish that made the most of humble ingredients. Instead of a flour-based pastry crust, which needed butter or lard, home cooks used leftover mashed potatoes as the top layer. Underneath was a mix of chopped onions, carrots, canned peas, or whatever vegetables were available. The mashed potatoes sealed it all in, forming a golden, crisp top once baked. This saved on rationed fats and gave leftovers a new purpose. Some cooks added cheese or poured in gravy if they had it, but even the simplest version felt satisfying. Recipes like this were especially popular in the 1940s, when meat was scarce and victory gardens were thriving. It was warm, filling, and frugal, everything a wartime dinner needed to be. More than that, it offered a sense of normalcy during uncertain times. Homemade mock sausage patties were born from necessity but stuck around because they worked. Without pork or ground meat, families turned to grains, beans, breadcrumbs, and heavy seasoning. Lentils, mashed beans, or oats were shaped into patties with garlic, sage, and onion to mimic sausage flavor. Fried in a skillet, they crisped up and filled the kitchen with a savory smell. Some added bacon grease or drippings to boost flavor. Wartime cookbooks promoted these meatless sausages as frugal and nourishing. They showed up at breakfast with eggs or tucked into lunch rolls. While they didn't fool anyone, the taste was close enough to satisfy. These patties weren't just substitutes, they were solutions, and that made them feel worth keeping. Leftover oatmeal bread was the perfect example of turning breakfast into something new. When bowls of oatmeal cooled and thickened, cooks folded the leftovers into bread dough. The oats made the loaf soft, moist, and helped stretch flour further. Some added molasses for sweetness, others left it plain for toast and sandwiches. Depression cookbooks called it porridge bread, listing it as wholesome and thrifty. It was about wasting nothing and making use of what you had. The result was a chewy loaf that paired well with soup, butter, or jam. For many families, it filled lunchboxes long after rationing ended. It was more than a recipe. It was a mindset. Use what's there, make it work. Even now, it's a smart way to stretch ingredients and bake something hearty. Gelatin fruit suspensions were colorful centerpieces made from shelf-stable ingredients. Canned peaches, pineapple, or fruit cocktail were suspended in flavored gelatin, lime, cherry, or orange. These wobbly salads showed up at potlucks, holiday meals, and family dinners. The fruit added sweetness, while the gelatin kept it festive on a budget. Some families mixed in whipped cream or cottage cheese to make it feel richer. Cookbooks in the 1950s and 60s pushed them as modern and fun. They stretched one can of fruit into a dish that looked impressive without costing much. Kids loved the colors, adults loved the ease. It was one of the few fancy dishes you could make in hard times without needing fresh food. A little wobble on the plate reminded everyone that celebration didn't have to be expensive. Salt pork scraps and beans delivered bold flavor on a tight budget. Even the tiniest pieces of salt pork, often trimmed from larger cuts or saved in a jar, were enough to enrich an entire pot of beans. Sautéed first to release their fat, these bits added smoky, salty depth to navy beans, black-eyed peas, or pintos. You didn't need much, just enough to give the dish character. This trick was especially popular in southern kitchens and appeared in many WPA cookbooks under economy meals. Beans were cheap, hearty, and easy to grow or store, but the salt pork made them feel like more than just filler. If you had onions or garlic, those went in too. The goal was to create something warming and flavorful from almost nothing, and it worked. Families remembered these dishes long after better cuts of meat returned to the table. For many, beans and pork scraps were more than a backup. They were a tradition. One pot could feed a family and still leave enough for lunch the next day. Milquetoast supper dish was soft, warm, and quietly comforting. Slices of stale bread were laid in a shallow bowl, then doused in hot milk and finished with a bit of butter, sugar, or salt, depending on whether you wanted something sweet or savory. It was simple, almost bland by today's standards, but it offered warmth and calories when nothing else was available. During the Great Depression and World War II, this dish became a go-to for families with limited resources, especially for children or the elderly. It required only 2 or 3 ingredients, and it was easy to prepare with what most people already had on hand. Some added cinnamon or raisins if they had them, turning it into a quiet treat. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For many, it was the meal they associated with bedtime or sick days, a kind of edible reassurance that things would be okay. And while it rarely appears in kitchens today, it remains a soft-spoken symbol of resilience and resourcefulness from a time when both were in short supply. A wedge of Parmesan is a kitchen essential, but what happens when all that's left is the hard, seemingly inedible rind? Most people toss it without hesitation, but that leftover piece holds a secret. It's packed with deep, concentrated flavor. Dropped into a simmering pot of soup, stew, or tomato sauce, a cheese rind melts down just enough to infuse dishes with a rich, umami depth that no store-bought seasoning can replicate. This technique isn't new. Italian cooks have been using Parmesan rinds in minestrone for generations. The slow heat coaxes out the last remnants of flavor, turning a leftover into a valuable ingredient. And it's not just for Parmesan. The rinds of aged cheeses like Pecorino or Gruyere work just as well, adding complexity to broths or even enhancing homemade risotto. For those who don't need them immediately, freezing cheese rinds ensures they're always on hand. Instead of buying expensive pre-made soup bases or flavor enhancers, saving and repurposing rinds does the job naturally. Creative cooking is about making every part of an ingredient count. A cheese rind may not be something you eat on its own, but in the right dish, it transforms from a forgotten scrap into the secret weapon of a well-balanced meal. Potato peel soup is another classic dish. Now, it's not just watermelons. People actually tried saving the peels and skins off of everything: apples, oranges, and even potatoes. It's because next to corn, things like these were the easiest food to get in the country around that time. Potato peels were especially necessary because they had an incredible amount of fiber in them, which meant that you would go a lot longer between your soup and the next meal. It helps keep your appetite low, and anything that did that during the Depression was something people really needed more and more of. Potato peel soup was a cost-effective and simple way to have some kind of sustenance on the table. All you needed was water and the peels. People would add basic seasonings like spices or salt and pepper, but it wouldn't really do all that much. Despite that, people still stuck to this like it was their bread and butter, because it was simply one of the cheapest meals you could have. Eating without worrying about how it's affecting your budget or your supplies is actual rest and relaxation, and that's something people were living without almost every day. In Texas as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world, since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. A pot of cooked rice never seems to run out. It starts as a side dish, but by the next day, it's a cold, clumpy afterthought in the fridge. Instead of letting it dry out or tossing it, turn it into something new. Leftover rice is one of the most versatile ingredients in the kitchen, capable of becoming an entirely different meal with minimal effort. Fried rice is the obvious choice, and for good reason. Restaurants don't use fresh rice. They use day-old grains because they fry up better. A quick toss in a pan with some oil, vegetables, and seasonings transforms leftovers into a dish that's even better the second time around. But that's not the only option. Rice pudding takes the same leftovers in a completely different direction. A little milk, sugar, and a dash of cinnamon turn last night's dinner into a warm, comforting dessert. And if neither of those appeal, rice also works as a thickener in soups or a filler in meatloaf, stretching meals further without anyone noticing. Freezing rice is another smart move. Packed in portioned bags, it reheats quickly without losing texture. Whether used for savory or sweet dishes, no grain should go to waste, because in the right hands, leftovers are just ingredients waiting for a second chance. Split pea cakes are another example of how often peas and beans were the saving grace of American households during the Depression. The best thing about these things was arguably how easy they were to make. All you had to do was boil them, which meant that lots of people could effectively use this recipe. Some of the Depression-era recipes straight up just don't apply to people who don't have certain kitchen appliances or ovens or a steady supply of electricity. Split peas were something everyone had, from urban areas to outskirts and rural ones. It also helped that split peas worked so well with the kinds of things people already had on hand. A binder, like all-purpose flour or some mashed potatoes, was also really helpful in holding the mix together. Plus, they went great with potatoes overall. The thing is, though, and this is really important in why people chose cakes over easier meals, is because people sorely missed sweets. Thanks to the Depression, basically any item that could be used for baking or even just for a change of taste wasn't something you'd ever find anymore. It was too expensive, too costly, and it meant that people never got the desserts they grew up with. That really dampened people's spirits all year round, and peas were common enough that people could spare some for a cake once a week. In Texas as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Now, bacon grease might seem like a strange thing to highlight, but hear me out. In a time when oil was scarce, bacon grease was like liquid gold. It was used for everything from frying potatoes to greasing pans. And let's be honest, it adds a flavor boost to just about anything. Can you imagine making biscuits with bacon grease? Oh, it was good. Bacon was one of the few adorable meats during this time, and it left behind grease, which was way too good to just toss out. Now, I know this bad boy has no nutritional value, but sometimes all you need is a little flavor in your life, and it's fine to have cheat days sometimes, right? So, while it might not be the healthiest option, it certainly helped to make those Dust Bowl meals a little more enjoyable. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived in Iowa during the Great Depression. She recalls cooking with bacon grease, which she called her family's Tuscan olive oil. So, you might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. A lemon's job doesn't end after the juice is squeezed. That fragrant peel, often tossed aside, is packed with flavor and hidden uses that go far beyond the fruit bowl. Grated citrus zest, whether from lemons, oranges, or limes, adds an instant boost to cakes, marinades, and salad dressings, turning ordinary dishes into something brighter and more complex. It's a classic way to maximize ingredients without spending an extra dime. For those who want to ditch store-bought cleaners, citrus peels are the secret to a homemade alternative. Soaking them in vinegar for a couple of weeks creates a natural grease-cutting cleaner with a fresh, citrusy scent. It's a smarter, chemical-free way to keep countertops shining while making full use of every part of the fruit. Clever cooks don't stop there. Freezing zest in small portions ensures that flavor is always on hand, ready to be sprinkled into sauces or baked goods. And if there's an abundance of peels, dehydrating them and grinding them into a fine powder creates a homemade citrus seasoning, perfect for adding brightness to everything from seafood to roasted vegetables. Now, you've heard of lots of kinds of different sandwiches, but a bean sandwich might be new even for us. What does it typically consist of? Well, you basically treat the beans as a spread here. The cooked beans often get mashed, and then they're mixed with seasonings and herbs to add a bit of an aromatic kick to them. Typically, people were using regional beans that were really easy to get. You know as well as I do that convenience runs in the blood of every American, my friend. Pinto beans, navy beans, and kidney beans were some of the most accessible kinds of beans around and were the easiest to get. Lots of hardship economically meant that people had no option but to rely on things like these for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but particularly breakfast. With lunch and dinner, you could still run a soup or some kind of stew and get away with it. But what did people do for breakfast? Butter and toast? Couldn't have worked. You were saving that bread for more filling options, and butter was expensive. Things like bean sandwiches were really helpful because they were a reliable go-to breakfast option that also had a lot of health benefits like protein and fiber. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. We've got one thing straight: meat was scarce during the dust storm era, so jackrabbits became a surprising alternative. These nimble critters were abundant in the wild, and they provided a valuable source of protein. Jackrabbits were often stewed or roasted, and its meat was said to be quite flavorful when prepared correctly. Jackrabbits, those long-eared critters that seemed to hop faster than a speeding bullet, became a potential meal. I'm not sure how they caught them, but I imagine it was a wild chase through a dust storm. Cooking jackrabbit was more of a skill than creativity, and preparing this dinner was a labor of hard work as it was a lean meat that needed to be tenderized and seasoned well. But when done right, it was totally worth it. If you are considering giving up Starbucks as a hardship, just try making your coffee out of these plants. Dandelion coffee came into existence during the Dust Bowl when people could not afford coffee beans and other products. That's right, those yellow flowers that appear on your lawn in spring and are so annoying once provided the means to satisfy caffeine cravings at the survival level. For it, people would uproot dandelions, bake the roots until they were black and toasty, and then pulverize them into a brew. There was no sugar or cream, just the natural taste of roasted roots. It was not as strong as real coffee, but it provided people with something warm to drink in the mornings when they were unsure about the future. Moreover, dandelions were free and easily available, no need to go to Starbucks. To the chagrin of dandelion coffee, it is now considered a health drink. Rich in antioxidants, it is believed to have liver benefits and can be found at health food stores for a hefty price. It was not about the latest fad diet or the newest way to live a healthier lifestyle. It was about not going insane without your cup of coffee in the morning. I can't help but wonder how the farmers of Dust Bowl must have been feeling sipping on this dandelion brew and hoping for a better tomorrow and a decent cup of coffee. Now it is a retro chic beverage, while back then, dandelion coffee was a means of getting back to the normal, even if the normal tasted like the grass one mows. A loaf of bread has a short lifespan, but its usefulness doesn't end when it turns stale. Instead of tossing it, repurpose it into something that lasts: breadcrumbs. Whether it's for breading crispy chicken cutlets or adding texture to meatballs, homemade breadcrumbs are a simple, cost-effective alternative to store-bought varieties. Stale bread may have lost its softness, but with a quick blitz in a food processor, it transforms into a pantry staple that can extend the life of countless dishes. Preserving breadcrumbs is just as easy as making them. A quick toast in the oven removes any remaining moisture, ensuring they stay fresh for weeks. For longer storage, freezing them in airtight bags keeps them ready to use at a moment's notice. Buying prepackaged breadcrumbs might seem convenient, but why spend money on something that can be made in minutes from leftovers? Freshly made breadcrumbs have better texture and flavor than their processed counterparts, giving a crispier, more satisfying crunch. And if you're feeling creative, mix in dried herbs or grated cheese for a homemade Italian-style blend. Molasses, lard, bacon grease, these were the tools of the trade back then. Using them, people made all sorts of things like molasses porridge. Why was this something you wanted, especially over regular porridge? Well, it's simple. In the context of the economic crash out of the 1930s, milk was simply too much for people to afford regularly, and at the exact same time, porridge was something that people needed to eat every day. Molasses porridge was a very cheap dish that could make a big meal out of a small amount of ingredients. It was exactly the kind of thing you would need for a family back in those times, especially when so many families began to live together for fear of running out of resources too quickly. This was especially true for people who had elderly families. Molasses porridge was something that was seen in New England in their rural communities more than anywhere else. The reason porridge helped so much was because you could also add all kinds of scraps, leftovers, and dried fruit to it so that you could make it better. People would also add in stuff like lime, cinnamon, or nutmeg if they wanted to, and that would often make it better. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. If you believe that eating insects is a modern, sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke, they were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. Smoothies have a wholesome reputation, packed with fresh fruits and veggies. But there's one nutritious trick many overlook, using vegetable scraps. Those spinach leaves just past their prime, carrot tops you usually toss, even beet greens can blend effortlessly into your morning drink. Instead of letting these nutrient-rich leftovers wither away in the fridge, freezing them for smoothies means they stay fresh and ready, ensuring nothing valuable ends up wasted. Maximizing ingredients like this not only trims grocery bills but also boosts nutritional intake without extra cost. Surprisingly, carrot tops are high in antioxidants and minerals, rivaling more popular greens like kale. Blended with banana, frozen berries, or yogurt, these overlooked veggie scraps elevate homemade smoothies beyond anything store-bought versions offer, minus the added sugar or questionable additives. Creative cooks know to pre-portion and freeze these scraps in individual bags, ready for busy mornings. It's homemade convenience that cuts down both prep time and food waste. And speaking of store-bought shortcuts, why spend extra on powdered supplements or expensive health drinks when the best nutrients are already hiding in your kitchen? Fried bologna hash was a classic dish that got a lot of traction out of the middle of the 20th century. The dish was basically something that was insanely available in terms of ingredients. Bologna was a really easy-to-get processed meat, and it was often sold in these decently sized packages. It's always such a blessing when the company decides to, not skim off the top and actually give you a pretty generous package. Plus, bologna was quick, really quick. You opened the package it came in, then you just put in the rest of the stuff. Now, back then, people were mostly just relying on crops and vegetables they had grown on their own through their backyard gardens and rationing efforts. One of these was potatoes, which was honestly such a lifesaver. Onions were also something people added occasionally. As for the bologna itself, people would usually fry that until it was decently caramelized, and then they'd mix it in with potatoes for a starchy and savory aftertaste. The hash was something that people served on its own, or sometimes with, like, a fried egg. It really helped to add basic things like that because you were always getting less protein than you ideally should have. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought of eating a dandelion fresh from the fields, but our ancestors have done it all for us. Yeah, dandelion salad was a staple during the Dust Bowl era. Since there were no fancy crops to harvest, dandelions had to do the job, and they did it pretty well. People would harvest the dandelion greens and toss them in a salad. Now, I'm not saying it would win any Michelin stars, but hey, it provided some vitamins and roughage, which is more than you can say about canned tumbleweed leaves. To make dandelion salad, the leaves were washed and mixed with whatever other ingredients were available, things like onions, radishes, and even bits of bacon if you were lucky. Believe it or not, this salad was actually tasty. Or at least that's what I've heard. I guess we'll have to try it ourselves to know for sure. A half-eaten bag of potato chips never quite survives the test of time. Left open for just a little too long, they lose their crunch and become disappointingly stale. But before tossing them in the trash, consider this. Those chips still have one last job to do. Crushed up, they make the perfect crispy topping for casseroles, adding a layer of texture and flavor that takes baked dishes to the next level. Casseroles have always been about resourcefulness, a way to stretch ingredients and make the most of leftovers. That's why topping them with crushed chips, whether potato, tortilla, or even pretzels, fits right in. The heat from the oven revives their crispiness, giving dishes like tuna noodle casserole or baked macaroni and cheese a satisfying crunch. No breadcrumbs? No problem. Those leftover chips do the same job, just with more flavor. Maximizing ingredients also means using what's available instead of buying extra. Store-bought crispy toppings can be expensive, but repurposing stale chips costs nothing. And if there's a surplus, freezing them extends their shelf life, ensuring they're always on hand for the next meal. In a kitchen that values resourcefulness, nothing goes to waste, not even a forgotten bag of chips that lost its crunch. Loved these forgotten tricks? Tell us your favorite in the comments, tap like, and hit subscribe for more vintage kitchen magic.